Okay, it looks like we're live. Welcome, everyone. I am going to switch us to speaker view and ask everybody to make sure they've muted themselves. Welcome, everyone. We're here tonight for our, I think 6th virtual video screening and discussion. And tonight we're going to talk about the zoning code rewrite process that's both the city and the county are undergoing right now. As usual, I'll welcome you here, and then I'm gonna do a introduction to the topic, and then we'll watch a short 5-minute video about it. It's sort of like a zoning code 101 for people who may not be that familiar with it. And then we'll introduce our speakers. We're lucky to have 2 guests tonight, Marissa Keith and Richard Llewellyn, both who are members of the Boise City Zoning Code Advisory Committee, and Marissa is also on the Ada County Advisory Committee, so she brings the perspective of both to our discussion tonight. So with that, oh, and then we also have a great new guest host tonight, or co-host, I should say, Brian Ertz. He's a public interest attorney here in Boise, and he's going to help moderate the discussion. And he has a wealth of knowledge around land use issues. So anyway, with that, I'm going to introduce the topic. Both Boise City and Ada County are undergoing a years-long process to change all the laws that govern real estate development, AKA the zoning ordinances. Municipal zoning codes have a tremendous impact on the form of cities and by extension on the way people live in them. Zoning should not be confused with a comprehensive plan, which is a guiding document, an overall vision of what our community should look like. Whereas zoning ordinances translate the community's goals into actual enforceable rules and laws that provide the framework for all new development. The regulation of land use and zoning is one of the most important functions of municipal government, and especially here in Idaho, a deal and rule state, it is the primary power given to municipalities by the state. The primary purpose of zoning is to segregate uses that are thought to be incompatible. In practice, however, zoning is used as a permitting system to prevent new development from harming existing residents or businesses. Zoning is why you don't have a cement factory as a next door neighbor and why you can't open a small petting zoo in your backyard. Zoning may include regulation of the kinds of activities that will be acceptable on particular lots, such as open space, residential, agricultural, commercial, or industrial. The densities at which those activities may be performed, from low density housing such as single family houses to high density such as high-rise apartment buildings, the height of buildings, the amount of space structures may occupy, the location of a building on the lot, also known as setbacks, the proportion of the types of space on a lot, for example, how much landscape space and how much paved space, and how much parking must be provided. First, a little history of zoning. Before cities adopted zoning laws, virtually all transactions pertaining to building relied on trust and informal understandings. Under this system, small-scale local builders formed personal relationships with town officials, who in turn generally supported development projects as long as they did not threaten to injure the community in any obvious way. As cities grew and more conflicts arose, the United States government drafted model zoning planning ordinances in the early 1920s to facilitate states in drafting enabling laws. In 1926, the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Euclid versus Ambler upheld the constitutionality of zoning ordinances and gave municipalities authority over privately owned real property via zoning codes. It sounds like somebody isn't muted and there's a lot of background noise. So if everybody could just take a minute to make sure that you're muted, that would be helpful.
Eric is coming up.
Okay, I will see. It looks like everyone's muted, so I don't know what's going on. It's hard to tell. So, okay, we'll go back to it. I don't remember where it was, but I'll figure it out. So let's see. During the latter 20th century states passed legislation that encouraged localities to establish planning agencies, zoning laws, and procedures for administering them. In addition, national and state legislation that grew out of the environmental regulation and historic preservation movements of the 60s and 70s influenced local governments to further incorporate goals into their regulatory process. The new zoning and development approval procedures adopted by cities in the mid-60s and 70s ushered in a new regulatory regime that depended heavily upon procedures, professional expertise, and citizen participation. These laws also helped preserve open space in historic neighborhoods and protected home values in new suburbs. Whereas African American neighborhoods often got zoned for these uses while white Americans didn't want near them, and along with redlining caused property values in Black neighborhoods to erode, further entrenching segregation. As private cars became the dominant mode of transportation and fewer people walked to work or on errands, areas zoned for a single use got bigger. Car-centric development and parking minimums have had a huge impact on the look, functioning, and carbon footprint of American cities. There is no doubt that it is important to revisit the rules that govern an area's land use planning occasionally to update and modernize them, but it also creates an opportunity for profiteers to change the rules to further benefit them. Lately, however, we are seeing a movement to blame zoning laws for all manner of societal ills. Many blame zoning as a key factor in America's urban sprawl, segregation, and high housing costs. However, Houston, the largest American city without a municipal zoning ordinance, is also sprawling and segregated, making it at least a partial counterpoint to these arguments. As with any industry player, the development industry is moving an agenda that blames the planning process itself for the skyrocketing cost of housing and inevitably would like to have more, quote, by right construction that shuts citizens out of the process. Just like any industry representative, they would like to dismantle the regulatory framework that governs their industry and proposes deregulation as the answer. They assert that zoning code requirements and the public hearing process drives up costs and links it to a decrease in supply, which drives sales and rental prices. It's a story as grounded in simplicity as it is in developer self-interest. However, logic tells us that there is unceasing demand pipeline here in the fastest growing city and the fastest growing state in the nation, and that the market determines housing price. A developer will always charge what the market will bear, regardless of front-end costs. Meanwhile, as municipalities and elected leaders struggle to absorb explosive growth and skyrocketing housing costs, while also hungry for more tax revenue to provide the government service infrastructure necessary for new growth, they are all too happy to buy into the growth industry's simply build more narrative. This smooths the way for more rooftop revenue for them while also ignoring the major drivers of the housing crisis: structural inequality, stagnant wages, speculation, vacancy, short-term rentals, the financialization of housing, aka rent-backed securities, of housing on Wall Street at a scale unseen in history, and the fact that we desperately need to tamp the brakes on growth so that our systems have a chance to catch up. Ultimately, zoning is the product of a political process, and it serves the interests of those who control it. As both the city and county zoning code overhaul moves ahead, citizens must watchdog the entire process to ensure that it results in an improved code for the quality of life of the citizenry and not just for those who want the path cleared to make the most money while diminishing citizen input. Since new development can enhance or detract from residents' quality of life, foster or hinder economic development, and dramatically impact use options for individual property owners, it is critical that affected community members have meaningful input into the creation of zoning laws and development decisions. Okay, so that's the introduction. And we're gonna watch a short 5-minute video that's a really fantastic overview of zoning. So for anyone who might not be that familiar with zoning, a lot of the lingo and terminology might be new to them, this is a good overview. It's a video I just found online, and it's pretty educational. So, oops, think I forgot one step in this process. Hold on. It's just like last time. Hold on. Okay, try it again.
Developed thanks to a little known and sometimes arcane set of rules and regulations known as the zoning code. Zoning influences everything from building heights to signage. Understanding the zoning code is key to understanding US cities and how to influence them for the better. In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of zoning. I'm going to describe the pros and cons of zoning. And finally, I'm going to tell you how you can influence the zoning code in your community to make them more walkable, bikeable, and equitable. So let's start with zoning basics. The zoning code consists of two basic parts, the map and the regulations. Let's start with the map. If you've ever played a SimCity game, you have an idea of how a zoning map works. Every parcel in a city is placed in a zoning district that specifies the types of uses allowed. Now, every city can create their own zoning districts, but they all generally have the same basic types of districts. They are residential, from single-family homes to high-rise apartments in yellow, commercial, including retail, restaurants, and hotels, colored red, industrial, in gray, though some maps will show them in purple, institutional, which means schools and public buildings, typically in blue, and open space in green appropriately. Here's an example of a zoning map. You can see that most of the city is residential in yellow, there's a large industrial section in the northeast, and a few areas of commercial in red. Now zoning maps can get a lot more complicated than just 5 colors. Now in this example map here, you can see all of the colors just mentioned, with the addition of an orangish color for multifamily residential. It's common for zoning districts to separate not only uses, but intensity of uses. You'll often see C1, C2, and C3 zones, where the increasing number means it allows increasing levels of commercial density. In addition, you may also see overlay zones. These zones, as the name implies, lays over the top of other zones and adds additional restrictions and regulations within them. Okay, so that's the map. It assigns every parcel to a district that has its own set of rules regarding use and intensity. Next up are the regulations themselves. Now, this is where zoning gets its reputation for being so boring. There's no video game that simulates the writing of a zoning code, but it's where all of the important stuff is located, so let's dive in and make some sense out of it. The zoning code, or ordinance, contains sections for each of the zones found in the map. Within these sections, there's typically a use table. This table lists all of the permitted uses within each zone. For example, a use table for a commercial zone may have a bakery as an allowed use, but an auto salvage yard is not an allowed use. Many use tables also classify some uses as conditional uses or special uses. These uses aren't allowed outright, but require some consultation and approval from the city government first. It's more of a case-by-case basis situation. After the use table comes the basic development requirements. This means standards for things like building setbacks and side yards, minimum lot sizes, and building heights. Every city has different requirements for their zoning districts. After the use tables and development requirements for each zoning district, most zoning codes will contain impact regulations, or regulations that are not specific to any one zoning district. These often include regulations for signage, parking standards, historic preservation standards, and urban design criteria. So that's a really quick overview of the zoning code. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, that all sounds really reasonable. And you know what? You're right, it is reasonable. And that's one of the benefits of zoning. Zoning tries its best to ensure that new development is built in a way that's predictable, reasonable, and minimizes impact to adjacent property owners. It's why city leaders installed zoning codes in many cities over 100 years ago. Zoning ensures that an oil refinery can't be built adjacent to a neighborhood of single-family homes. I think we can all agree that's a pretty worthwhile goal. Increasingly, however, planners, civic leaders, and community members have begun to question the practice of zoning. For all of its positive aspects, there are quite a few negative qualities too, and I'll list a couple of the biggest ones. First, communities can use zoning codes as a tool of exclusion. Historically, this happened explicitly. Cities would literally write zoning codes that excluded people from districts based on skin color or ethnicity. Now, these were clearly unconstitutional and eventually removed, but these explicit codes gave way to implicit ones that many communities still use today. The most common way to exclude people using the zoning code is by imposing large minimum lot size requirements and other regulations that increase the cost of building a home. If new homes must be built on 1-acre lots or larger, for example, only large expensive homes will be built. This allows cities to become enclaves for the rich at the expense of low and moderate income families. The second major criticism comes from the segregation of uses that I described as a positive before. Segregating uses can also lead to sterile environments and force citizens to travel large distances between different zones for trips to work, school, shopping, and home. Many communities have introduced mixed-use zones that allow for a mixture of residential and commercial uses to mitigate this problem, though mixed-use zones are typically not widespread across zoning maps. Alternatives to traditional single-use zoning, such as form-based codes, aim to reform zoning and move away from the segregation paradigm. Form-based codes regulate the size and shape of buildings instead of their use. So that's zoning in a nutshell. Potentially useful, but probably could be better. How do you make zoning work better in your community? The first step, go to your city's website and find the page for their planning department, sometimes known as the Community Development Department. In most cities, they will post upcoming meetings and town halls. You may get lucky and your community is in the midst of a zoning code revision. These happen rarely, but when they do, it is an excellent opportunity to make your voice heard. You can attend a meeting and give your opinion, send it in to a planning staff or elected official, or write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. You can tell them to include more mixed-use zones that allow for vibrant, walkable places. If your community isn't going through a zoning code revision, and that's probably the case, you can do many of the same things, but instead you must make a case that the zoning code is in need of a refresh. Your elected officials may not be aware that their zoning code could be better. You could be starting a much-needed conversation in your city. The bottom line is that if you want great cities, you need a zoning code that makes it perfectly easy and legal to build great development projects. Zoning might sound like a boring place to start, but it literally determines what can and can't be built in your community.
Okay, we're back. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sometimes it's hard to tell. So that was a video. It was hard to find anything online. That was just kind of a good overview. It definitely seemed to have a point of view that some of us may or may not agree with, but it was the best just sort of zoning code 101 that I could find. So I hope you found it helpful. Now I wanted to introduce our guests. We have Richard Llewellyn. He is a Boise native who grew up on farmland between Eagle and Boise. By profession, he is a biologist while also balancing duties as the president of the Northwest Neighborhood Association. He is one of only a few neighborhood representatives on Boise's Zoning Code Citizens Advisory Committee. And then Marissa is the president of the Southwest Ada County Alliance Neighborhood Association. And for the last 3 years, where her primary focus has been safe streets for all users, as well as advocating for new developments to be where existing infrastructure is located and be appropriate in density for the neighborhood. She sits on both the Boise and Ada County Zoning Code Overhaul committees, as well as the Canals to Pathways group, and says that she can always be found at ACHD meetings. In her quote unquote free time, she is a licensed social worker and has worked in the field of developmental disabilities for nearly 20 years. She has lived in Boise nearly all of her life, grew up in Garden City, and now lives in Ada County in the Boise area of impact. Okay, so the way this is going to work is each of the guests will have 5 minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So let's see, I'm going to have I'm going to have Richard go first. So let's see, Richard.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is really encouraging. Seeing so many people participating. So we're about, what is it, Marissa? We're about a third through our 2-year process or so, maybe roughly. It's a little odd because it kind of started and it had a stutter with the change of administration and of course the pandemic, et cetera. But it's really great. People are participating, showing up and learning about it. But we don't know what it is yet. Most of our discussions so far, most of our committee meetings have been kind of extremely high level and kind of dealing with, kind of a lot of kind of feelings around it. And then, but just in this last one, we started to actually see a little bit of some potential substantive recommendations from the consultants. So this is run by consultants as well as City of Boise planning staff. And, it's really great that we're taking 2 years to do this. So that's great. It is also great that we have a 20-member committee. That makes it a little hard for everybody to participate during our zoning committee meetings. But I think what is really essential is that the community, Boiseans, learn what this is about at this point, because we're just going to start to get actually something substantive in the next few weeks. So we're going to get a draft. I don't think it's out yet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Marissa. Where we could actually begin to see what all this means on the ground. So I just like to mostly speak. I don't want to speak necessarily about what is the right density. The right density kind of depends where you are, what the purpose is, et cetera. It's debatable. But the process to get to that density, I think, is really important. And what the focus right now, the city, at least the planning staff involved and the consultants, are to make the process as predictable and simple as possible. And while that may sound good, I think there's kind of an axis here between predictability on one side and flexibility on the other. And predictability is, we're discussing predictability as predictability more for developers, it seems to me, by doing things like eliminating conditional use permits, by eliminating perhaps planned unit developments and going entirely to subdivisions, by eliminating or reducing variances that are required, by eliminating and reducing public hearings. All this adds to predictability, but at what expense? I think that often it's the residents of an area who actually know what a specific site, the requirements, the opportunities, the challenges of a specific site. And the more the residents can weigh in throughout the process, the better. And I'm afraid that this whole push towards predictability is intentionally designed to remove that almost entirely. So essentially, if you kind of upzone to a certain level and have a density that is then entitled by right, there essentially, it doesn't have to be much of a public process. You can then just do a straight subdivision. There's no necessarily incentive or ability to negotiate for clustering, density. And so you could have some open space. There's no ability to push for a trail, for instance, access to, perhaps the Boise River or, another waterway. There's no ability at that point for the city to negotiate for these site-specific benefits that the residents can really say, hey, this is a great opportunity. So I probably already went over my 5 minutes. Is that right, Lori?
If you have more to say.
I could just keep talking, but I think maybe that's good. I think that's good for right now.
A good intro. Okay.
Yeah, I got lots more to say, but that's my intro.
Okay, great. Marissa, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. So I would have to agree with everything that Richard has said. I look at it, the Southwest Ada County Alliance, we span both the city of Boise and we go into Ada County, into the area of impact. So when I'm listening to the zoning committee, I really try to envision what this might look like for the area of impact, which is that future city of Boise. And right now, the only way that the area of impact is being affected is when we have developers come in that are along the city limit and ask for an annexation and rezone. But in the future, as things get tighter, as land gets more scarce in the city of Boise, I imagine that they'll start pushing out into the area of impact more. So we definitely have a more rural characteristic out here. People are very nervous about, what does this mean for my neighborhood? We have a lot of older neighborhoods with large lots that are going to be very attractive for upzoning. And one of the things that has kind of struck me through this whole thing is we have a lot of different opinions on the committee, which is good. We get to hear all sides of the debate, and there's a lot of sidebar conversations that happen in the chat that sometimes get brought to the main conversation and sometimes are just kind of cut off. But one of the main concerns that I think a lot of people are feeling is that how will density be shared throughout the city? And right now there are some areas of the city that feel growth more than others. And is that going to continue under this new zoning rewrite? Is it going to be changed so that certain areas are protected and certain areas are not? So that's kind of my focus in looking at this, is in making sure if Boise is going to grow, that kind of the entire city needs to feel the pain, essentially. The other issue with the zoning rewrite is, as Richard said, just the lack, or not the lack of, but kind of the push towards making development happen by right. And while citizens can always write in comments when you hear about a development in your area, it won't necessarily go through that public process where you get to go testify down at City Hall, and those elected officials are accountable to you. And so that's one thing that does concern me, because I truly do feel that people have the right to be heard. They have a right to voice their opinion, whatever it may be, and any process that gets rid of that is a problem. And I know the consultant has talked a lot about, we're in a housing crisis. We need housing. We need it now. This process is already going to take 2 years, and then you still have to build these houses after, and how can they shorten that up? And so that's one of the things that they're working through. Lori?
Back to me. Thanks for your perspectives, both of you guys. I'm going to ask a follow-up question. So if density is increased by right, and for folks who don't know what that means, it's sort of an industry term, which basically says that it's basically in the zoning code to do things that maybe previously or currently require an application process and a public hearings and the entitlement process, where it goes through these steps through the quasi judicial hearing process. And instead of that, so that's like what Marissa was just talking about. So like people can weigh in, neighbors can weigh in. That won't happen in the future if there's more by right development / construction that happens. So that'll just be a decision that is made, as long as the development meets the development code, then the planning director will just sign off on it. And so that's very alarming for a lot of citizenry, because it feels a lot like we're just being shut out of the process. So if a lot more of that occurs, then how do we get to incorporate some of the more kind of livability components of the comprehensive plan, things around environmental stewardship, things around things that are particular to a neighborhood, like keeping drainage ditches and canals uncovered as wildlife corridors, etc. So do either of you guys want to respond to that?
I think one of the very first things we talked about as a committee, the consultant did, I guess, a critique of the current zoning code. And you can go to the website and you should be able to find it there. It actually was very honest, I thought. One thing he remarked a lot about was that they were surprised at the level of distrust that the citizens of Boise had with City Hall. And he felt that part of that distrust came from having a zoning code that did not match up with Blueprint Boise. And if you've read Blueprint Boise, it really is a very good document. It's very idealistic. It makes Boise sound like this place where everybody would want to live because of the ideals that are in there. But then when you hold it up against the zoning code, it falls flat. And comprehensive plans are not law. They're goals. zoning code is what rules when you go to planning. They have to follow the code. They don't necessarily feel that they need to follow the comprehensive plan. So I think that's one thing that hopefully the zoning code will do, is incorporate more of the actual comprehensive plan into the new code. But as I said, as Richard said, we haven't seen the new code yet. It's not, I don't think it's coming out until the end of April.
Yeah,
So I've got a question.
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So sort of along the same lines, Richard or Marissa, you haven't seen a copy of the new code. You're on the advisory committee. To me, it seems like being on the advisory committee, you would have some input into that initial draft. What have you guys been seeing as far as you've used the word upzone a couple of times, which is upzone is the process by which you expand or increase the allowable uses within a zoning designation, increase density by right. And to what degree do you see that this process is just a blanket upzone across Boise to allow more and more dense development?
Well, yeah, we haven't seen a whole lot of substantive changes yet. You know, it's been a process of, you know, a consultant asking us questions and then them kind of, you know, educating us along their beliefs. But just this last week, we did see kind of a very crude, high level ideas of changes. And one of those for my neighborhood is quite alarming, is to do away with the R1A zone entirely. Which is the area that pretty much all of our default open land and kind of pastures and farmland in, you know, this recently annexed area is R1A. And so they were going to do away with the R1A. That would immediately go to R1B. Currently, R1B is about 5 units per acre versus 2 in R1A. And then part of the problem with that is, again, it may be that much of this land ends up with that density or higher, but the process of getting there is so very critical. If you just simply entitle it by right, then you can have just blanket subdivisions. Even the city can't really control it. The city then gives away its own power to negotiate for something like a pathway, a traditional pathway along a fence line or a waterway or something. And that's happened here so many times. Especially it happens on the edges of the city where the city doesn't understand, doesn't have any knowledge, no institutional knowledge. They don't live out here. And so they're not going to bring these issues up early enough. And now it won't matter if they do, because if the developer can just do a straight subdivision at R1B, they don't have to negotiate for, you know, saving some trees, you know, using better pavers so you have, you know, the stormwater infiltrates and recharges groundwater and isn't just poured into our, you know, canals or our waterways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my perspective there. It's if we're getting rid of the R1A without negotiating for anything in return, and that's what this is, right? If we just do this in one fell swoop, everything that we need to get in return as a city, all the public good that we need to get, we somehow have to write that into the zoning code now. And I was very curious, you know, I was kind of like hopeful at the beginning of this process. These are experts. I was thinking, you know, I write computer algorithms and deal with complex situations. And one of the things we go back to all the time is it's Einstein's quote: make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And it's when you get simpler, that becomes simplistic. And when you get simplistic, it actually has more complex and complicated outcomes and unforeseen outcomes. And, you know, but that's hard. It's hard to be simple and yet pertain to the underlying reality. And so how is this done? I don't know. But like Marissa just said, somehow all of those policies of Blueprint Boise, of our comprehensive plan, need to be brought in to accompany any kind of increase in density by right, or else we just lose the ability to get those things.
Well, and if it's a broad sweep, then you're not going to have the citizen input that informs the decision makers about whether or not it's a good idea. That's what that public process is for, right?
Yeah.
When a developer asks for a rezone, there's a public hearing. There's a process, in fact, multiple public hearings. And it's only when that change in my neighborhood is happening that I'm motivated to show up and contribute and, you know, express the values associated with the character of my neighborhood that I care about, that I want to preserve, or the concerns that I have that should manifest as conditions to the approval, right? And so, but by doing it in one foul swoop, you're probably not going to hear all of that localized knowledge when that decision is made. Is that right? And so why was this process initiated like this? Was it they want affordable housing? What was the underlying justification for a zoning code rewrite or a blanket upzone, as it looks like it's going to be?
You want to take that, Marissa?
I think there were several reasons. I think part of it is the need for more housing in Boise. The other was that, at least according to the consultant, I have nothing to compare this to, but according to the consultant, Boise zone is just out of date and just not very modern anymore. And so they're trying to, one, clean it up, get rid of some of the inconsistencies, make some things more clear, and then also make it apply to the comprehensive plan more.
And I just want to pop in here and just say, if you Google zoning code rewrite, you'll see that lots of cities all across the country are going through this process. So it calls into the question whether or not this is an industry-driven change, whether it truly is updating from our car-centric development patterns. And then, you know, the argument that our laws, our zoning code is archaic and out of date, some would say it's been updated incrementally over time. When the comprehensive plan was adopted, it was incorporated in the zoning code, which was not that long ago. I don't know the exact year, maybe somebody else can jump in with some knowledge on that. But so yeah, so pick your reason, right?
And what I'm really concerned about is what both Richard and I think Marissa expressed it as well as, is there's a localized concern out in the impact, city impact, where when are we going to get to, you know, express ourselves and the concerns that we have? And if this process now is going to foreclose what would otherwise be available with the existing zoning code, that's significant, and that needs to be talked about. How do we prevent that from happening in the zoning code, from foreclosure of those opportunities for meaningful? So due process, which is when the city councilors, the P&Z and others are making decisions about zoning applications or development applications, due process requires that we be meaningfully heard. And if you're not meaningfully heard, if the outcome is predetermined, right? If the outcome on the approval or denial or the conditions is predetermined because the zoning code has been simplified, which is a nice word that they use,
Right.
then what does that say about whether or not we have a right to be meaningfully heard? If it's all, I mean, it's already pretty much a foregone conclusion, right? It's so difficult to contest development applications, not necessarily because the law isn't there to contest it, but because the decision makers are unwilling, or either they have a particular legal ideology, or they're unwilling to enforce. But I mean, have there been any assurances provided to you guys that there's going to be public opportunities as there is on individual development applications, or what? How is the consultant? Well, first, can you answer the question? What's the general makeup of the advisory committee? How many people are citizens that are concerned with the character of their neighborhood versus how many people are industry folk versus how many people are from what? Have you guys noticed that? And then who's the consultant? Where's the consultant from?
Can I just jump in real quick? I don't want to answer the question about the advisory committee, but I'm sure one of the other members can. But Erica pointed out in the chat that city staff is not writing this zoning code. Citizens are not writing this zoning code. The city contracted with Clarion Consultants out of Denver to write the code. And so all we really have, this is a service that they offer. They're consultants. They specialize in land use. They specialize in, I believe, zoning code overhauls and rewrites across the country. And so all we have to go by is maybe we can look at what they did in other cities, but we can also look here in Boise, because Clarion is who wrote the housing bonus ordinance, which passed over the holidays in a record short 3 months. It was something that they completely wrote, possibly with some industry folks. We never could get any information from the city about who, even with public records requests, who was engaged in that conversation to write and compose that. But there was limited citizen involvement, and it only came from us previewing the draft and basically writing city council staff with our opinions. And it was fast tracked basically over the holidays during a pandemic with City Hall closed down and people with their mind on the holidays. And so I just lay that out as an example of the work that we have seen from these consultants. And again, the whole concept of the housing bonus was basically fake affordability in exchange for, like a basket full of goodies for developers. So more density, less parking, smaller setbacks, etc. And so the affordability was so high as to be laughable, and the percentage of units that were required were minuscule, 10% in a building. So that's the evidence that we have. And so, yeah, we're right to be concerned about how much engagement is going to be involved in this. Now, the schedule for the entire overhaul on the city council's or city website has a schedule of different engagements, opportunities for the citizenry. Now, how much will be contributing to the basic aspect of it, or will it have all been pre-written and then we're just gonna pick the bushes and the the lighting, etc. We don't know. Richard?
Marissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but we were told that Boisean citizens could weigh in on the draft as soon as it was out, which sounds like it will be out in April. And so that's really super critical that everybody, and when we get, and then we do weigh in. It's not sexy, right? People get all fired up when they see something right next to them, but they don't get it. Like when the laws that are going to change the whole city are changed, that's really important. Yeah, the housing bonus ordinance, in my mind, that was an attempt to negotiate, right? So I've been saying somehow you have to negotiate for some good in exchange for entitling developers by a right to, frankly, make one heck of a lot more money. But if you don't negotiate, if you go in to a used car lot and say, I'll buy everything you got for the price you're asking, you're not negotiating. And that is essentially what that was doing, because $18.70 per month for a 3-bedroom apartment. That was the negotiated price, and they only have to have 15% of the apartments at that rate in order to qualify for all these bonuses. that's already above market rate for new apartments in a lot of the city. So the city's getting absolutely nothing in exchange. We as citizens are losing the ability in this so-called streamlined process to weigh in. There won't even be public hearings for a lot of those. So that is very alarming. And yeah, and if you're going to negotiate, if you're going to bargain, you got to actually get those numbers right. otherwise they're meaningless. So.
I guess I have a couple of comments. Kind of going off of what Brian was saying, the whole idea that the public may not be able to voice their concerns as they would have prior going through meetings. I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but for most people, they hear zoning rewrite, they hear housing crisis, and they think it's all taken care of. So I think if a lot of people knew exactly what this meant, like what rezoning actually means, I think that would be helpful to get more people engaged. It doesn't seem like, at least people that I deal with, it's just a headline on an article, and it's assumed that, the city and whoever is taking care of it, and it's, nothing to worry about. So I guess one thing would be, public awareness. How do we think we could bring that up a little bit so people actually understand what's going on? Kind of what Lori's doing, obviously, but maybe bring it out bigger where it's, I don't know if it's signs or whatever, yard signs. The other thing I had was I get the argument that, okay, if the city wants to grow, right? That's an if. The city doesn't have to grow. Other Meridian could grow, right? But if the city has to grow, and the argument is that we need to have higher density, are they talking about also prescribing types of homes that can be built, right? I mean, if you can increase the density and then you end up getting, high-end condos, well, that's different than high density for people that live here and work here. So on that committee, are they talking about that, or is that, I'm just curious about that topic in particular.
We've talked about like the types of housing that we would be okay with having within our developed neighborhoods. And they've put up pictures of some different types that can be found here around Boise. But they also put up kind of these 4- and 5-star story apartment buildings. And I think my concern with it is that the pictures they show us are really cute and pretty and have a lot of character, but I know that's not what's going to be built, because you can look around here and see the type of stuff they're building. And so, yeah, they do want to put density within the current developments where they can. And not all neighborhoods will be subject to that based on things like whether you're in a historic district or whether you have strict CC&Rs on your property. It's the other neighborhoods that are going to have to take in that extra density.
Are they specifically saying, within this density, we want, a portion of them to be mid-income, portion to be low income, and a portion to be high? Or is that too prescriptive, and we're just gonna identify density and let development take care of that? Is it getting to that point where it's prescribing? Because I think, you may get public to kind of go on board with some of that if there's a mosaic of development. But if that's a key component that's being left out, I think that should be really highlighted.
Yeah, let me jump on that, and maybe Brian can say, and Lori can say something as well. So what you just described makes a lot of sense, I think, to a lot of us, where you actually do have some requirements for different levels of affordability, or required housing at a certain percent at a certain level, a certain expense. That's essentially called inclusionary zoning a lot of times. And that the belief is that that's not legal in Idaho. And there is some, and Brian can talk more about this, but it is difficult, most certainly in Idaho, to require that what you just said, certain, units at certain prices, different price points. And so then that again goes back to the issue of, well, how can you get that? You can get it if you negotiate for it upon a rezone. If you say, because in Idaho, a private property owner has absolutely no inherent right to a rezone. So then the city can say, well, this rezoning, according to our ordinance, is supposed to be in the public benefit. We think that you should have, have 20% of these at whatever, 80% AMI or whatever. And then, they can go back and forth and come up with something like that. But at least it's the belief that they cannot write that into the code or the ordinance as it is. And I'll let Brian, maybe Brian, you can say something about that.
Well, the degree of the prohibition on inclusionary zoning, which is what you guys are describing, which is there a way that we can write this requirement into the zoning code? And let's say no. Idaho law prohibits inclusionary zoning. That's very different than, is there a way we can get that outcome? The answer to that is yes. And it's exactly what Richard just said, which is to say that on a case-by-case basis, a city council or a P&Z or even a development department that had the political will to actually make that happen could do that by being more aggressive on behalf of the public with their approval process, where they have the discretion to do so. And Richard, you're exactly right that on rezones, they have a great deal more discretion to make that push, even if they don't, because it's what they call a quasi-legislative decision. And so there, you heard Lori talk about quasi-judicial decisions. Quasi-judicial decisions are where the city is saying yes or no to an application, and it's a matter of right. So it's the criteria that the zoning code sets out, and the city council sitting there as judges deciding whether or not they can check the boxes on the criteria that are at code, whether the facts show that it's consistent with the code. When a developer goes to a city council and asks for a rezone, that's a different process. A zoning, depending on the scope of the zone, is more discretionary, because a zoning decision like that it affects more people within the area on the map, and has a broader interest, and so it's more like legislation, right? And so courts are less likely to beat back city councils that act in a legislative capacity when they're making those broad level policy decisions versus the individual application. And so that, by recognizing, rather than granting the rezone as a blanket rezone to increase density, as apparently is happening now, overall, the city council can retain that discretion and set a tone with developers in the market such that developers will understand that discretionary rezone decision, they're more likely to get an approval if it provides that blue collar housing in addition to the luxury units in the higher density, right? Because that really is the problem. We hear a whole lot. I mean, the speaker before nailed it on the head. We hear a whole lot about, we need more housing, but housing for who, right? Is it housing for incoming Silicon Valley upper middle class and upper class people? Or is it housing for middle class and people that don't make those six-figure wages a year, right? And right now, what we see as a city, what we see is apparently a policy that's geared toward the upper middle class and the upper class housing. And we see the luxury apartments all over the place. I mean, I'm an attorney and I can't afford to live in a lot of Boise, right? And that's probably the poor decision on the public interest advocacy that Lori mentioned that I made personally, but that really is what we're talking about. Affordable for who? And so whether or not this zoning code process can secure express inclusionary zoning outcomes that you're talking about by requiring individuals or individual applications to include 15 or 20% for this median income maker, probably not at this level. But there are absolutely myriad ways to effectuate, to make that outcome happen through the discretionary mechanisms that exist now, which is why we need to be so vigilant, especially with this process, because it looks like they may be removing those mechanisms that the city council has to ensure that we have affordable housing, and not just affordable housing for rich people, but affordable housing for the rest of us too.
Right, and that's the whole point, is how, unfortunate would it be to find ourselves, 10 years down the road going, well, this was all for, affordable housing or a mosaic of housing. And to 10 years down the road, look around and go, oh shit, no, this just allowed density and the market built what it built. So yeah, calling that out. And that's why I asked that question, was because that is the narrative, right? That's what's getting people to kind of back off on it. So thanks for explaining that whole inclusionary, that I didn't know. That makes total sense to me how that works. And so yet again, in the name of making it clear cut for development, we're handing off yet another tool that we have to shape density and affordability. So yeah, thank you. I
just want to set the record straight that inclusionary zoning is not illegal in Idaho. It just has never been litigated to the Supreme Court. So it was a false narrative. It is a false narrative that people like to say that it's not allowed, but Ketchum tried it, and developers threatened to sue, and that was sort of as far as it's gotten now. Could Boise take its considerable city attorney's office and try to pursue that in a legal case? That, yeah, they could, just like they did with a camping ban for homeless people, but they haven't chosen to do that. So we continue to not have put laws in place that mandate developers do their part for the public good, as far as including actually affordable housing in their new developments. And they continue to be primarily, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 houses, new construction, or upscale, very expensive apartments with really nothing in between. So it's not a great development pattern, and we need more tools in our toolbox. So inclusionary zoning could be one of them. Other questions? Looks like Barbara's done.
I had a comment. I just wanted to say, the question was asked, what part of the 20-member rezone committee are industry versus citizens versus maybe something else. And I did listen in on the last rezone meeting, and one topic that was discussed made me feel like it was heavily weighted towards pro-development or industry type people. And that was when they got to the topic about, and Marissa and Richard may be able to help me with, they were talking about the structures or the appearance of the structures that would be on an infill development or a whatever, and I think the consultant was his idea was to tie it to a zone 1A or a zone 1B would have this much setback versus this height versus, you know, the form. What would it be? The form and the appearance. And the several spoke up and strongly. It's like, you know, we don't want that attached. We want to have the ability to be creative. And so at first I thought, well, that would offer some protection if that was attached to the zone, but it was apparent to me that that was did not find favor.
I bet Richard can take that one.
Yeah, that was really interesting, and I'm glad you noticed that. So in Boise, we have, you know, you start out at planning and zoning. If it's not just an administrative review, if it will actually go to a hearing, and fewer things will go to planning and zoning, then to city council often, and then most larger developments end up in design review. And design review tends to be a board that has a lot of architects on it, and they typically discuss and kind of review what the thing is going to look like. At least that's kind of the overall how we understand it. And the consultant has said Boise relies on its design review much more than other cities. So part of their desire to simplify and make it more predictable is to reduce the power of design review, essentially. And a number of those people, several of those people who spoke up, actually are on design review, and they're architects. And I found it really interesting because I thought what they said was completely right. What they were saying was, look, if you simplify the design aspect so much that we essentially no longer have a role. They didn't say that, but you know, on design review, us as architects, there won't be any creativity. There will just be kind of cookie cutter compliance with these very simplistic, is essentially what they were saying, rules. And I found it fascinating that they were bringing up these things in their realm, and quite eloquently. I thought their arguments were good, but it was just in this specific narrow element, you know, range of design review of how things look, materials, etc. I think that conversation needs to be had on the whole process. You know, how does the development fit into the lay of the land? How does it impact other neighbors in various ways, etc. So I think their arguments were great, but we just need to expand them to the rest of us. But in terms of the makeup, I don't know. I'm afraid always to do this categorization. Marissa and I are neighborhood people. We have maybe another person or two who are mainly neighborhood people. It is heavily skewed towards at least the architects and all. I know that some developers didn't get on that wanted to be. So yeah, it's not. It's. I don't know, Marissa. Do you have a point of view of that?
Yeah, I don't know what the percentage is. Lori, didn't you do a post about that, like where everybody worked? And
yeah,
on Vanishing Boise, I think.
I can send it to Barbara or anyone else who might want to see.
Yeah. I know the range of knowledge on that group is pretty broad. Like there's some people that this is their job. You know, they are paid to do zoning and planning and all that. And then there's some people where, you know, you're either volunteer or there are just a few citizens on there also that are just interested and want to participate.
Well, and I also agree, you know, that we wouldn't want to eliminate citizen input for these infill developments, and that does appear what's going to happen if people don't get involved on the rezone. I also have a question. So what does anyone here know? What am I echoing?
A little bit, yeah. It's just starting.
So if your subdivision has covenants, are they not protective? Like if it says each lot has to be a certain size, say a 1/3 acre, and they come in and zone it mixed use. So do the covenants not protect you then? When you bought your home, this was the covenant.
So
it's not a homeowners association, it's covenant, just
right. The consultant and some others attorneys I've talked to, and Brian can probably answer this, they've said that the city is not going to get in the middle of a dispute between CC&Rs and a developer. That when a developer buys that piece of land, just like when you buy that land, when you close, you sign those CC&Rs saying that you're gonna, or that covenant saying you're gonna abide by it. What somebody alluded to was that there may be some developers that are willing to challenge that covenant in court. And, you know, if it comes down to a money issue, then, you know, developers have a lot of money and they can write off the cost of that, a high paid attorney. Citizens, you gotta pass the hat and hope you come up with enough to hire a good, you know, if you can find one, to hire an attorney.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Brian could answer that.
That dispute is likely ripe for a challenge. There's not going to be a single rule. It depends on the situation. It'd be unwise for me to indicate, but you're exactly right, Marissa, in the sense, and that really is the tone at City Hall anyway, with a lot of these development decisions, is that, you know, P&Z and City Council know that depending on the decision they make, which side is more likely to litigate, which side has the resources, and they might deny that influences their decision, but they'd be doing so. It does influence their decisions. The zone change probably isn't going to affect anything that existed in CC&Rs in the past, if it was an existing vested property right. But
Yeah.
there are going to be those that are willing to beat that with a hammer in court.
yeah.
So
Yeah, it'll be interesting when they get this all done with the when you look at Blueprint Boise, and they're wanting the high density near activity centers and transit, right? Transit lines. There's large acres. I mean, there's acreage lots right near Boise City Mall.
Yeah.
And so.
Okay,
well,
go ahead, Brian. I was just going to move on to the next question with you and answer. Go ahead.
no, but I was going to say that's another opportunity, though. When we're talking about the cynicism of lawyers, is that if we did have a city that had the will to actually extend protections to those of us that are being left behind in this mega boom of growth, then we could do things like let's test that inclusionary zoning question with this process. And in fact, the city of Boise just got what, $30 million from the federal government or whatever, and so and they've got a legion of attorneys. They're in a very good position to test in a favorable way for the public protective legislation. which is zoning ordinances. And so they should be, and they should feel compelled to do that. And this is where to do that. To be progressive about that insistence that, you know what, we do need to protect workers who have lived here their whole lives, who are being forced out. I do eviction defense work as part of my practice. They're moving. Fruitland, Melba. That's what's happening. Everybody's being displaced. I mean, that's what eviction court is. You want to talk about watching people that have lived there their whole lives being moved out. And that's a direct response to the housing affordability crisis. And so let's see some really aggressive provisions in the zoning process. Get the lawyers to use their brilliance on finding the right cleave on inclusionary language.
Great. We've got a question in the room here, so I'm just going to turn my computer and get it.
Oh, this is a question for Richard and Marissa, and I probably should have asked it earlier. It's a philosophical question, and I don't want to belabor it, but I think it's a point that Richard and Marissa might want to speak to. When I worked for the federal government, we had a saying that just because of your failure to plan doesn't constitute an emergency on my part. I'll take you back to the first meeting of this committee. Was there a come to Jesus discussion in the room about how this city really arrived at a housing crisis, the housing crisis that we're now expected to suck up and remedy? I'm just trying to probe the intellectual honesty of the process that you're engaged in, and just whether housing crisis was the starting point and there was no substantive discussion of how at least some of this crisis has been manufactured. It didn't just drop off the turnip truck. It happened for a reason. Obviously, there are market forces, but give me the tenor of the honesty of the discussion that permeates your entire committee's work, if you can. The other question is more parochial. We've heard that things like overlay zoning and historic district zoning will not survive this process. I wonder if you have a read on that.
Is Richard still there? I can't. Oh, there you are. I lost you on the screen. What I understand, the historic districts will stay. The overlay zoning is to be taken care of within the general code. So they think, the consultants have said that Boise is using overlay zoning to fix the problems that are in the current code. And if they fix those problems, they won't need overlay.
Okay.
For most part. Is that right? Am I remembering that right, Richard? Is it okay?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I had a computer crisis there. That's what I remember. I didn't remember the specific issue with the historic districts, but I don't remember one way or the other. Overlay zones they don't like. I don't understand that myself, and I also don't understand how you can fix them by changing the underlying zoning district, because there's only going to be a small handful of underlying zoning districts. To me, overlay districts make a lot of sense. You kind of map, add these hierarchical layers of area specific issues, but that's me. The larger question, it's a hard one. We don't talk that much. The housing bonus supposedly is going to deal with the affordability part of it. So we don't really talk about affordability much anymore. I think also because, some of us might bring up Richard Florida's points that, Richard Florida was one of the architects of the new urbanism, which means more density. And he now says, doesn't work unless you inclusionary zone for affordability or something like that. So we don't really talk about affordability much anymore. We don't really talk about how we got here. And nor do we talk about all the other issues about affordability. Claudia Fernsworth is here, and Claudia could tell us a thing or two about just building CBs doesn't mean that they're going to be used. She had a whole bunch sit empty at her right across her place for what, almost a year.
Yep, a whole year. The Rose Street townhomes were sitting there waiting for people to buy, which we were told they were going to be sold, and now they're being rented for, well, $2,000 a month for some of them. That's what I've heard. The rest I haven't heard. The Silver Cloud, it's very interesting. The Silver Cloud apartments, a 1-bedroom, not the junior 1-bedroom, but the regular 1-bedrooms were $900. They've gone up to $1,300 for a 1-bedroom apartment. So it's
So for people who don't know, the Corey Burton built a bunch of townhomes in the northwest 20.
22, I think.
22.
But they're building 22 more, and then they're going to develop. One of Corey Burton's subsidiaries is developing another maybe 50.
And so, they got approved. We need housing. And so they built them, and then they let them, hey, can somebody mute themselves? There's some background noise going on with TV or something. And then they sat empty for a year. And I believe one of the media outlets interviewed him, and I'm not sure what answer he gave, and maybe someone else can jump in, but it indicates that this, like, we just need to build more, but if you're not actually putting them on the market, it's not solving the quote unquote problem that we are trying to address. And then ultimately, it was indicated at the public hearing that those would be owner occupied, and I believe he sold them all to an investor, and now they're rental properties. And so the neighborhood was given assurances that they would be owner occupied. And this is a neighborhood that has just a massive amount of apartments being built in their neighborhood. Like, I don't know, 80%, I think, of the new construction has been basically investor owned apartments. And so they're wanting to get some neighbors who are going to stick around, and they were, told one thing and then something different happened. And so just shows how difficult it is as neighbors, as citizens, to, shape our community, because it seems like often the developers hold all the cards. And even when they make agreements, they change them depending on their financial bottom line, essentially.
Well, I was told, I called the city when I saw them putting blinds in there.
Yeah.
Who puts blinds in when you're going to sell them?
Oh,
and
right.
I called the city, and the lady said to me, well, we can't stop someone who owns something from renting it out. That was her exact words. And I thought, well, plus the investment company that Corey Barton sold to is one of his subsidiaries.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or like flesh it out better than I did?
I was just going to say that, yeah, we never have really talked about why Boise has a housing crisis. The very first meeting, I don't know, the first couple of meetings, honestly, it was more like we were being talked at more than we were talking as a group. And so I think this last meeting was better, but definitely the committee, the advisory committee does not control the agenda. The agenda is provided to us, and they kind of don't like us to get too far away from what's on the agenda. So some of these discussions are kind of cut off, or we continue them in the chat amongst ourselves. But yeah, there's not much talk about, the the economic reasons or the market reasons why it is like it is right now.
Can you hit on with that advisory committee? I mean, when I think of that, I think of, a group of people helping guide a process where, questions are asked, and the consultant who's hired to facilitate this would use that information, work it into the plan, come back and say, hey, this is, we heard you, this is what we're thinking of addressing that. Is that how that process is going? Or is it just you're getting, PowerPoints of what they're doing on their own? Can you give me a level of engagement on how the advisory committee is actually shaping this process?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know yet because we have not seen the code. We'll see it hopefully at the end of April. This whole process was started under Mayor Beater. So this consultant has kind of been working since, I don't even know when this process started. Richard was on the committee under Mayor Beater, and then he was placed on here by the new mayor. But some of this stuff I think has already been decided, and I don't know. I get the feeling that in some ways they're just trying to sell it to us. But I guess we'll see when the new code when the new proposed code comes out, what if they've taken any of our suggestions and made changes.
Yeah, that's my sense too. I mean, this right now, between now and this next meeting, we'll start to see if they're actually listening to us. It was interesting. They did seem to listen to the architects, or at least the consultant expressed frustration, and that the architects were not saying what he expected them to say, which was, we need to simplify, have more predictability. That's the whole mantra now. We did kind of talk about more like affordability at first, but that might have been either superseded by the housing bonus ordinance, or maybe is a little too complicated, perhaps. So now it's all about predictability. But if we can say it's predictable and it's going to be bad, that's not necessarily great either. I mean, for the neighbors. I mean, for the neighbors who are living in an area now with a pasture next to them, or neighbors that they like, et cetera, et cetera. If they're happy with where they live and maybe have lived for a long time, it's not going to be predictable for them. It will predictably change. So I guess that's a form of meta predictability, but not exactly what most of us think of. So, but predictable for developers, yes.
Right. So we've got just a few minutes left. I like to end them at 9, but I'm excited about the level of engagement. So if people have more questions, we can talk about continuing. Are there, by raise of hands, how many people have questions before we wrap this up? Okay, Chris has another one. And then just before we go on, so maybe we'll just do one more question. And then in the chat, it says, one of the HUD reports the city has to provide says the following, quote, various public participation forums yielded comments that the perception of the planning and development services process is challenging for multifamily development. The chart below enumerates the classifications of the number of acres included in the zoning area. Oh, I think I might be reading the wrong one. Hold on. Oh, here it is.
You jumped ahead, Lori. I posted too.
I did. Sorry. So another point in this HUD document says, based on the analysis of the Boise zoning classifications that would permit construction of multifamily affordable rental units, it appears that the city has provided for an adequate supply of land that would be suitable for multifamily development. And then it talks about a chart. Sorry, I guess that's still not quite what I wanted to say.
So
here it is right here. So we wanted to, there's a thing about how independent review of the planning process said that it isn't onerous, and it doesn't take up too much time, and it doesn't need to be streamlined compared to other cities. And so this is an actual report that was provided by the city, I think. I don't know, Erica.
this is a report the city writes to provide to the federal government.
Right.
So this is them talking about their own issues And then they're telling us the issues exist when in their own words, they don't really exist.
Right.
You know,
Interesting.
one thing I just like to really important to throw out there along the same lines. Marissa, did you ever come up with another estimate of how many housing units were permitted that you know of in your area that have not yet been built? Or I know that, you know, it was in the potentially in the numbers of thousands of housing
Yeah.
units that have gone through the whole process for a long time, a lot of them, right? And just haven't been built. So it's really the bottleneck here in Boise is not the permitting process, because most things get permitted anyway. But anyway, yeah, I'll shut up.
Yeah, we did it's an informal census, very informal, from the last couple years. And we went through and looked at all of the developments that had been approved in Southwest Boise. And we also included the one development in Kuna by the golf course on Cloverdale, because all of those people will be coming to Boise and not going to Kuna. So we came up with that there were about 5,000 lots that had been approved between Kuna, this part of Ada County, and the city of Boise that had not been built yet. And this was, I think we did this last summer, so I haven't looked at it since. It's probably shrunk a little bit because we haven't had too many developments come through lately. But yeah, I think the bottleneck is in the construction. I don't know, people like to blame the neighborhood association or the neighbors that come out to
The NIMBYs.
the NIMBYs. They like to blame those people for the reason why there's not housing being built. But if you've paid any attention to City Hall, you know that there's very, very few projects that are denied by City Hall or by Ada County. So I just don't buy that argument when people bring that up.
Okay, we'll take that final question from Chris and then wrap it up.
It's kind of a question, kind of a comment. I mean, a lot of good topics were brought up, and I'm sure there's people on this call probably have a lot more. I'm wondering if there's a way, maybe either Richard or Marissa, if I could email you some questions, or even better, would be like a shared Google Doc that people could say, hey, what about this? And for you two that are on this advisory committee, you may be able to quickly look through these, and 90% of them are kind of like, not much, but there may be a few things that if people were allowed to do that, over this process, you might bring up some topics that you could potentially bring up. So I guess my question is, maybe we could think about that. And if people were interested, it would essentially be someone, would have to create a Google Doc. You invite people via emails to have access to it. And then, I could go in there and write my little comment, or anyone could do that. But that way, maybe when you guys go to those meetings, it could almost help you through that process, or at least try to get because it sounds like from just a pure resident, I don't work for the industry. I don't do anything. I just live in my house, and I've been fixing it up for 10 years and all that. Right. And so I don't know how to get my voice out. So I'm just kind of wondering, maybe something to think about. I think that would be helpful for the people that are interested. It might be a way that we could actually say something, and if it's worth anything, you guys could maybe bring it up at the meeting if possible.
That's a great idea. And Richard's the king of Google Docs, so he'll probably happily whip one up, or maybe I will. But yeah, I will definitely promise you as a follow-up to this conversation that we'll do that. And then as far as these video screening and discussions, I promised folks we would do it in February, and then we extend it into March. And so we might keep doing it into April. And it might be worthwhile to revisit this as a topic in another one. So after another meeting of the Citizen Advisory Committee, when we've got this draft document that's come out, we can have another one of these discussions about it and ask more questions and get a preview, etc. So stay tuned for that. And thank you, everybody, especially, oh, Richard's got something else, yeah?
Just one real quick. These meetings are open to the public, and they've done a pretty good job, I think, of attempting to save a little time at the end for just members of the public to ask questions. So take advantage of that. And if not, they are then also stored online. But yes, if you can attend yourself, it's great.
When are
Yeah,
they?
I forgot to tell you. So they're streamed live on their YouTube channel. The city has a YouTube channel. I think it's called like City of Boise, like planning services. And you can go to that page, and then they have all of their city council meetings and then the zoning code rewrite committee meetings. And so you could actually go and you could watch all 5 of them or 6 of them if you wanted to right now. And if you do watch them in real time when they're happening, there's a live chat option. They do take questions and ask the panel while it's happening. And that we're not sure, but maybe your comments would then be on the record. So definitely consider that if you're really interested in it. So with that, I will try to share that on the Vanishing Boise. Well, I actually have shared it already, but someone remind me, they're Thursday the 3rd. I'm not sure what day of the month they are. Richard, Marissa.
Third Thursday at 3 p.m.
At 3 p.m. Yeah. And then I don't know about the county ones. Marissa, do you want to throw out the meeting date for those?
Oh, the counties, they've only had one so far. That was in February. I'm not exactly sure when the date of the next one is. They're just getting started. So they have talked a little bit about like combining zones, and there might be the hint of what is it? The ordinance for adequate infrastructure there, which is exciting. But yeah, they haven't really started doing a lot there yet. So I'll find out. I think the next one is in April, but I think they're also on Thursdays. Thursdays are busy when they're all like on the same day too.
So is this. So yeah, so the county also is live streaming theirs, I think both on their Facebook and on their YouTube channel. So you can watch those in real time or afterwards as well. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming, especially for Marissa and Richard for filling us in on what's been happening with the Zoning Code Rewrite Committee. And Brian Ertz, thank you for being here and bringing your considerable knowledge as a land use specialist attorney. And everyone else for joining us. This is the most people we've had on one of our live streams. So I appreciate you all being here. So, okay, good night.